Okay, so now we're moving toward the land. We have seen the Israelites come out of the land of Egypt, the land of oppression and affliction, through the leadership of Moses and God through the wilderness. He has brought them to the edge of the promised land. So you have, beginning in the book of Numbers, that the Israelites are positioned across the Jordan River from Jericho in the plains of Moab, which is an area just to the northeast of the Dead Sea. In that area, which is probably also the region of the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in the patriarchal narrative back in the book of Genesis. And we now think that Sodom and Gomorrah were not south of the Dead Sea, but actually just to the northeast of the Dead Sea in the excavations, for example, of Tal Hammam there in just across the Jordan from Jericho. And so we have the Israelites being in that region. The Balaam narrative has Israel in that region. And so then the preparation, after the conclusion of the book of Deuteronomy, we come into the beginning of the Joshua narrative in the discussion of the preparation. The spies are sent over and they come back. And then in dramatic fashion, this second generation of Israel, with the first generation of leaders and military having died in the wilderness during that 40 years experience of the wilderness. They are now positioned to cross the river, and in many ways is a reenactment of the crossing of the Red Sea, the Yam Suf back in the book of Exodus, as a demonstration of God's ability to deliver his people and to bring them forth into the promised land, like he did bringing them out of the land of Egypt. And so then they set up camp at Gilgal, which means circle, and it describes the circle of stones, covenant ceremony, circumcision, and they hold the first Passover. And then begins the conquest narrative. First, stage one, God's demonstration of his power. All the Israelites have to do is march around on the last day, blow the trumpets, and the walls come crumbling down, and the city is destroyed by the Israelite army. And then part two is they move up into the hill country in Bethel and Ai. Part three is the narrative of what we call the Southern Campaign, initiated by this treaty with the Gibeonites, which are just northwest of Jerusalem. And that treaty leads to, of course, the Southern Campaign against this coalition of cities and their kings, led by King Adonizedek of Jerusalem. So that coalition is defeated there near Gibeon. The incident of the sun standing still and the omens of the text that lead to the campaign reaching down into the southern area of what would later be the tribal territory of Judah. So that's the Southern Campaign. And then in chapter 11, we have the Northern Campaign, a similar coalition led by Jabin of Hatzor, does battle against the Israelites. Beginning at Mount Merom, they drive those armies off to the north. They come back and burn the city of Hatzor. And so that's the Joshua narrative in the first 12 chapters. It's summarized then, and then chapters 13 and following focus first upon the status of the Israelites in the land and the division of the territory among the tribes. One of the interesting parts about the second half of Joshua is that in each of those territories there is at least one unconquered city. That is, Israelites had allowed certain cities to remain in Canaanite hands. And as we look at the pattern of those, they're typically along the coastal areas, along the edge of the hill country, or up in the Jezreel Valley. And those will, of course, become the contention as we get over into the book of Judges. Those people in the land that the Israelites will then become worshipers like the Canaanites, worshiping Baal, Asherah, and other deities. Again, the narrative that's described in the first two chapters of the book of Judges. And so we'll look at that part. And we'll also then look at then this context of the Israelites' emergence in the land of Canaan, ultimately to be the dominant people group. And that's really not until the time of David. So we have again, the book of Judges, and its cyclical telling of the story of different regions and different people groups. And this narrative that is described in Deuteronomy is the people are unfaithful. God would allow them to go through periods of oppression by foreigners. When the people finally cry out to God in repentance, God raises up a leader, a judge, we often call them, to lead them in driving out these foreign elements from the land. So the cyclical story becomes very much a pattern for the rest of history. But it's very interesting that the warnings in the latter two chapters of the book of Joshua, Joshua's farewell address in chapter 23 and the covenant ceremony in chapter 4, warn against the issues that will happen if the Israelites don't complete the task of driving out the Canaanites from the land. Judges tells the story of what happens as a result of their lack of faith and following God's instruction to drive out the foreign elements that would lead them into idolatry. So then, again, we'll look at next in the aspects of the Israelites in this early period of Samuel and the struggle against different people groups, but especially against the Philistines, who have emerged now as also a people group vying for control of the territory of what we call often the Promised Land.